Okay, are there any questions before Amy gets started by any of the presenters? We'll go very quickly today so we can finish as close to the end of school as possible. Any questions? All right, Amy, you are first up today. Would you like extended time?
Like a minute?
Yeah, I'll do my very best to be mindful of that. Okay, you may begin whenever you're ready.
Hello, my name is Amy Polio Alford, and as many of you know, I'm from the United States of America, born and raised, which makes me American. As many of you also know, my father is Chilean, which makes me Chilean. And I know a lot about the United States history, but I don't know that much about Chilean history, and this is why I wanted to do this presentation, because I wanted to teach you and teach myself about something that's so important to my culture. This is a video of the coup that started the dictatorship. In 1973, Pinochet declared himself as president by bombing La Moneda while separating families, ruining the economy, and leaving a lasting impact. So, what was the Chilean dictatorship? On September 11, 1973, the military coup overthrew democratically elected President Allende. You might be wondering, who was mainly politically involved? Well, that would be a great question. If you guessed the United States, then you'd be correct. In fact, President Ford was the first president to publicly acknowledge and defend the CIA's actions in Chilean politics. Now, why was the United States politically involved in Chilean politics? I mean, it's a country in Latin America, why would they care? Well, Allende was an extreme socialist, as close as you can get to communist. And the United States didn't like that. They were trying to prevent the spread of leftist movements. So how was the United States involved? Well, journalist Seymour Hersh exposed the CIA and discovered that they were in fact funding right-wing politics. And the committee found that the CIA had carried out multiple covert actions in Chile, but they had not been directly involved with the 1973 coup. Right there are some declassified files. If you want to know more about it, you can look online. So, when did the dictatorship start? Well, Allende had a truce happen right before noon, and he was allowed to have all the civilians leave, leaving him in the capital with a few officers, 200 to be exact. And at noon, bombing began, and Allende was later found dead, and a 2011 autopsy confirmed that he committed suicide. So, the start of Pinochet's reign. A lot of people consider him a savior because he took out Allende, a very extreme socialist. Now, is that really the case? I argue no, because when he assumed presidency, he dismantled Congress, outlawed Chilean left-wing parties, and rounded up anyone who disagreed with him. Basically, he took away the people's right to speak freely. So how did Pinochet affect the country? Well, he affected the church to move. The church was the only counterweight to the dictatorship. They were with the people, they were helping people. In fact, the church under Pinochet was immediate to help victims, not only from the Catholic Church, but from other churches as well. So you might be wondering, what did the church do for the people? Well, Pri Silvia Enriquez established the Casa de la Solidaridad in Santiago, where they encouraged every religion, every denomination to help their cause, because everyone should be like the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37. So, in their 16 years of service, they comforted mothers. They helped find missing people, and they found news about loved ones, and many were killed because of what they did. Now, you might be wondering, is the church still helping people in Chile today? And this is true, actually, they are. Wildfires happened throughout Chile this year in January, and some of my family's homes were threatened because of the wildfire, fearing that they would be destroyed. But the church was quick, helping with water, food, supply, shelter, everything they needed to make sure that they would be okay. So, another thing that people say that Pinochet is the savior of Chile is because he saved the economy. But I'm here to argue, no. I did some research about Allende's economy and Pinochet's economy, and Allende was facing hyperinflation. And because he was a socialist, and he just started to give out money to people, obviously, to help them instead of trying to fix the hyperinflation he was about to face. In fact, when he tried to reach out to other countries, they were suddenly unable to help. If you guessed the United States had something to do with this, then you'd be correct. In fact, the United States pressured allies to not help Chile because Allende was a socialist and they did not agree with him. So, what did Pinochet and his stabilization policy look like? He eliminated subsidies, increased taxes, and prices were no longer regulated. Inflation grew at a faster rate. And he did manage to stabilize the economy, which is great, until the recession of 1975. And then he stabilized the economy again, which is great, until the recession of 1981. Basically, his stabilization plans were failing. So here is inflation in Chile. During Allende's presidency, my grandparents told me that there was no milk and there was nothing. And during Pinochet's dictatorship, my grandparents told me that there was no milk and there was nothing. Basically, there was no difference. Everyone was just poor, with no food and no money. So, how did Pinochet affect the people? This is a photo I took at La Memoria. La Memoria is a museum that focuses on everything that happened at the dictatorship so that people don't forget all the cruelties that happened. Each one is a picture of someone who was assassinated by Pinochet or, his people. So Pinochet and his policies against the people. An estimated 2,600 to 3,400 Chilean citizens were executed or disappeared, while another estimated 30,000, 300,000 were tortured. And this is another picture I took at La Memoria. This curtain looks like a seamless curtain, but if you look closely, you'll see that there's a bunch of names, and all the names are the names of people who have disappeared. We can assume they're dead. The day of the coup, the Chilean army detained thousands of people the day of the coup happened. Anyone who was suspected to be opposed to the dictatorship was captured. In fact, they were all taken to the Chilean National Stadium, where they received brutal conditions, were deprived of food and beaten, and many of their bodies were secretly disposed of so the families would never find out what happened to them. Eventually, there was a culture shift in Chile, though, because how long can really people stay silent? It started off with music. Pinochet tried to silence music. And he started off with the example of Victor Jara, who was assassinated after being cruelly tortured. So you either had to accept censorship or leave. But this ended up being one of the biggest active generations of musicians. In fact, Los Prisioneros, a band that my father and I really liked, became very political and helped people with the Chilean dictatorship because of it. So, how did Pinochet impact politics? A lot of people also claim that he's a savior of Chile because he took away a communist president, thus changing the politics and changing communist propaganda. Well, if you didn't know, Pinochet changed the Constitution back in 1981. And that Constitution hasn't changed since then. We still have a dictatorship Constitution, which is not a very good thing. Even though there's amendments to it, it's still a Constitution that gives more rights to the rich than it does to the poor, instead of giving rights to everybody equally. In fact, I could talk about all the impacts that Pinochet has left to this day, but I'm going to talk about one that affects my grandparents personally: the privatization of water. In Chile, right here, as you can see, behind those fences, there's water, and it goes underneath the houses of my grandparents' whole neighborhood. And here in America, that would be considered well water. It's your water rightfully. You don't have to pay for that. But in Chile, my grandparents have to pay for their own water that a rich company just took up and sells it back to them, especially since they're facing drought right now. They're always facing a drought. Chile is a very dry land, meaning that they're paying even more water for water that is rightfully theirs. So, how did Pinochet impact literature? If you guessed that he burned everything that he didn't agree with, or that he felt threatened his power, then you'd be correct. He wanted to keep the people uneducated. The person that I interviewed for my pitch presentation told me that he had a book about Cubism. Now you might think that's a book about Cuba, maybe a book about communism, but no, it's a book about cubes, the geometric shape. He was taken and tortured because of his book on cubes. So, why should you care? Why should you care about a country you've probably never seen, you probably will never be to, and I'm probably the only Chilean you've ever met, and I'm half white? Well, you should care because 36% of people in Chile think that Pinochet was justified. That because he did some good things here or there, that he was okay to be in power. But that should not be the case. This is a toxic mentality. If you start to think like this, if you start to justify someone being in power for too long, or justify someone's evil actions, then you could destroy your own democracy. So this is what I want to leave off with you guys. Just because it hasn't happened in the United States before, doesn't mean it won't happen in the future. So my message to you is to protect your democracy so you don't end up like Chile.
questions for Amy?
Yes.
So was Pinochet partnered with the church or was he against the church?
He was against the church. That's why they were killed for what they did. Any other questions?
So the privatization, how many companies are there that run the water?
All water is privatized.
It's like how many companies?
I have no idea how many companies. I just know, I know there's two major ones for sure that sell water to the people. One of them owns the one that should be my grandparents' rightful water.
I have kind of a personal question.
Mhm.
How do your parents feel living in the United States? Like,
Well,
I can only imagine what it'd be like to live in a country where you feel like you don't have control.
mhm.
You just live life.
Well,
How they feel different here.
my mother never lived in Chile during the dictatorship, but she did live in Argentina during the Argentinian dictatorship. And my father lived through the whole Pinochet dictatorship. And I know that like he's always talking, he's very political and like very like sure that we're always getting our rights. He's like, you should go vote. Like you understand you have the freedom of speech. And it's like he's very ensuring that my brother and I are aware of that like our voices matter and to never let it shut down. Stuff like that. It means a lot to him. For this country.
Amy, what did you feel like you learned in this experience of studying this topic?
I learned it was a lot worse than I thought it was. Because people always justify him, so I've always heard arguments that he was a good dictator. And that's where I came up with this, why should you care? Because I realized that it's a toxic mentality. People began to justify him as a savior when he wasn't. He was a man who did a lot of awful things like I represented. And it made me realize that I think we get too comfortable with trying to erase the past sometimes as well.
Any other questions for Amy from the panel or from students?
What would you say to somebody that now would say, even today, I think he was the savior of Chile?
Well, I would ask them how and have a very good discussion, because a big thing of him is that he took away Allende, but Allende was in his last year and would have left office after that. So it wasn't like Pinochet who was there 17 years and did awful things. Allende was just a bad president. Pinochet was a cool dictator.
Prior to Pinochet, was everybody just presidents elected by the people, or
Yes,
for a certain term of office?
4
Or
years like the United States.
Okay.
After Pinochet, it's now 4 years, and you have to take a 4-year break to prevent another dictatorship from happening, and then 4 years again. Yes?
In the graph that you showed showing the difference between Allende and Pinochet, yeah, there was a spike, but then it went down below Allende's level in a couple years afterwards. So it did look like he affected some pretty permanent changes.
Well, the difference was the same. Even though the economy was doing slightly better and inflation, there was no food to go around. It was the same effect according to my father. But right here's where his regime ends, and then other presidents, they almost eliminated inflation after him. So he didn't fix the economy.
Oh, I didn't realize how long Pinochet was.
Yeah.
So what's the numbers on the left? I can't see. Is that 5%?
That's 9.
Oh, 9.
900.
Wow. That's a lot.
Mhm.
That's a lot of inflation.
Okay.
We're trying to keep ours at 2, so 9 would be a lot.
Yeah.
And 900?
Right,
Mhm.
that's crazy. Great job, Amy.